food is always delicious, and they serve it so well. So pat them on the back as well as applaud for them when you can. Second of all, I would call to your attention the material that's on the second page of your program for this evening about Tippy McMichael herself and the lecture series. And I hope you'll read that at your convenience and know that everything we do with the Tippy McMichael Committee comes from the largesse of this woman who loved St. Paul's and gave us an endowment in her will that enabled us to do all of this wonderful work with the Tippy McMichael series. So I want to quote our former rector, Lowell Grisham, saying, "Remember us in your will." And this really does come from people who are very much in love with St. Paul's and everything we do here. Third, I'd like to call your attention to the material in the back for our next event, which we are calling actually just a community conversation. There are several people in Northwest Arkansas who have spent some time going to various areas on the U.S.-Mexico border, doing volunteer work, feeding people who are there waiting for asylum who've been left on the Mexican side with the return to Mexico policy that the Trump administration has imposed. In addition to feeding these people, they are witnessing the examples that they see of our government reacting to this large population that has been now put into 10 cities in Mexico, and doing their best to help feed the families, work with the children, try to make their lives as humane as possible. So on the evening of Saturday, April 18th, we'll have Jill Acree, who's actually from Conway, will be with us. Jordan Gershon, who is here from Fayetteville, and Gwen Gertz, whom I actually know pretty well because I'm married to her. And she will be here. She is now, many of them have been to several sites and have seen the activity going on at the border. So please do come. And I've told all three of the leaders, don't consider these to be formal talks that you have to give. I've asked each of them to sort of begin with about a 10-minute introduction to some issues that they've seen involved down there. But my guess is that a great many people would like simply have the opportunity to ask questions and say, what can we do? The way news media work, various things have shoved the asylum and the immigration system off page one. The impeachment material has shoved it off page one. Now the coronavirus has shoved it off page one. But you should know that at this very moment there are 3,500 people living in tents in Matamoros, and many of them are being taken to the airport every morning and put in shackles and being flown to Guatemala where they don't know where they're being taken. So there's all sorts of things going on that we need to know about, and I think many people want to say, what can we do about it? So we'll spend the evening on April 18th doing that. So please come, and if you know people who are interested in that, right here, right smack here, right here. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Evan, who will introduce our guest for tonight.
Thank you, David. Glad that y'all are here, and I hope you'll come back tomorrow. Don't forget to spring forward. We spring forward overnight. Isn't it just like me to schedule a guest preacher on Spring Forward Sunday? But you don't forget to spring forward so that you can be here tomorrow at 10 o'clock when Tippy will talk about following Jesus to the border in one way or another. But our guest this weekend, today and tomorrow, is Winnie Varghese. You can read her biographical information there on the inside of your leaflet. You'll read that she is on the senior clergy team at Trinity Wall Street in New York, that she also was the rector of St. Mark's in the Bowery there in New York, and also spent some time in Los Angeles. But what I would tell you perhaps isn't there on the leaflet. I got to know Winnie fairly well during the last triennium, a 3-year term, where Winnie was the chair of the Committee on the State of the Church for the Episcopal Church, and I had the privilege of being a member of that committee, and I really enjoyed my time with Winnie, and I saw Winnie use her gifts, her humor, her tenacious spirit, her willingness to build relationships with all the people on that committee to do some pretty important work, even though people in positions of power might have resisted some of that work. And it's Winnie's spirit for the work of the gospel in ways that often people in positions of power might resist that I find kind of irresistibly attractive. And I've been looking forward to sharing this space with Winnie and having her join us. Would you join me in welcoming Winnie Varghese?
How are you doing? Yeah, you're right. I'm so happy to be here. I've been trying to get here for years. I've heard about this church. Everybody knows Lowell, as you know, and I've known Evan for a while, and I've been trying to figure out how to get here, and it is just, I'm so glad it finally worked out. I'm sorry that it's happening during a virus scare, but besides that, I'm really, really happy to be here, and I'm happy that you all aren't afraid to gather in public yet, because I think that's about to happen in a lot of places. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here, and Evan and I were talking about this. Lowell's one of the happiest guys I've ever met. And so it made me wonder what this church was like, frankly, and who lived in Fayetteville, like what was going on. And I think I'm starting to understand a little bit about that. And Evan didn't tell you the most boring thing about me. Evan also is delightful and, like Lowell, known in the larger work of the church, well known and well respected. Both of you are. Is what I'm actually known for in the church is that I'm really good if you need someone to help you take a vote. There might be no less interesting thing on the planet, but that's actually kind of what I'm known for in the Episcopal Church. So I've written a talk. I might veer off it a little bit because I prefer to tell stories than to give a talk, but I'm going to try because we do have a topic and there's something I want you to think about and some things that I think we've learned over the last couple of years at Trinity Church that might be useful in the climate that we live in today. And that I'd like you to think about, assuming that you are thinking about similar things and frankly doing similar work. And the difference might be that at Trinity Church, we have an enormous amount of money. It's obscene, and we know that about ourselves. It is a grave responsibility to have that much money as a church. And we have been thinking, as people have in every generation at Trinity Church, what does faithfulness look like with that kind of resource? And that's been our work. And so we have been trying to think about how to have impact for good in the world on the right issues at the right scale for who we are. Acknowledging also who we are, that we are real people with real hangups and real limitations, and what can we do together. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing, knowing that you have things in your life that parallel that as well, and in your own communities. So I'm going to do that, and then we can talk. As one of my friends says, who does a lot of these, she's happy to have a question and answer session, but she doesn't have any answers. But she's happy to, and that's how I feel. I'm happy to respond, but I'm not sure I've got answers to the kinds of questions you might have, but I bet those answers are in this room, and we can do that together. So first, because we're in a church, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to pray right out of the prayer book, because we've got some good ones. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So it is very good to be here. I don't know if you can hear it in my accent, but I grew up in Dallas, Texas. So yeah, I think it's a no that you can't hear it. But it's really nice to be here because it looks like Dallas to me. I don't know what you call this landscape, but this is very familiar and it's happy. So glad to be here, and it's a good break from March in New York City, which is just hideous. So, and thank you to the committee that invited me. I'm really honored to be a part of this weekend. So first, we have an activity. I know you all talked before. I saw people socializing. You seem like a really good, social, friendly crew, but I still want you to do this. Can you turn? I don't know if it'll work to turn behind you, but don't talk to the people that you came with unless they don't know the answer to this question. And I want you to introduce yourself, and I want you to tell the person that you choose to talk to. You could move if you want to as well, if you need to do it for this. If you belong to a community of faith of some kind, including this one, which one, and what issue in our public life concerns you the most? So if you can't pick one, if you really can't prioritize it, just pick one, because you only have a couple of minutes. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to say change. So one person can just talk until I say change, and then the other person talks. So you don't have to regulate time. Does that work? Yeah? So you're going to talk to somebody for whom that would be an interesting conversation, right? All right, go ahead.
and I'm virtually deaf. So if I look blank, don't blame yourself.
Can you hear me with that?
I can hear that, but a lot I can't hear.
Okay. Okay. All right, if you can wrap up what you're saying and change. All right, if you can start to wrap up. All right, if you have any final words, now's the time. We're going to wrap up. And I'm ready. Really good. And we're going to hear from each other. You don't want me to sing. Right, it's getting quieter, yeah. We'll bring it back. Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be very good. You've done the first exercise really well. Right? No, it's very good. Very good. I have friends that are really talented at starting a song or something like that. I've never learned how to do that. So, well, the first thing we all know about organizing of any kind, organizing for change, is the wisdom is in the room, right? You don't need an expert to come in from outside and talk about what your community needs and where your power is to make that change, right? It's right here in the room. So this is just for the room, for the sake of the room as we start this conversation. So you don't have to take turns unless you really must. I know some places are really polite. Just say what community of faith the person you talked to said they were a part of. Just say it. Yep, great. Yeah, that was a nice variety of communities, right? You're from all over. And now, this will be more complicated, but much more fun. So also say, try to use 10 words or less. What did the person you talked to, or one of the people you talked to, say was the issue that most concerned them right now? Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. That was for you all. We all heard different things, right? Depending on where we're sitting. But you heard them, right? Just to put it up in the air. There's a lot that weighs on us. I'm going to tell you about a very particular scenario at Trinity. I'm going to tell you about one thing that we're working on. There's a lot that weighs on us. And I want you to listen, and I know you will, for where you already are in the work that is about the things that weigh on you the most. Or is it that the work that the places you are or your communities are engaged in are not that thing? And do you need to find something else as well? Or are there reasons for that? But think about that. I think about that. Am I working on the things that weigh on my heart the most? The things that God has given to me because they weigh on my heart. They're for me. All right, so thank you for doing that. I hope you met someone interesting. I bet you did. I hope the conversation was good. So last year, in the middle of one of the many crises we've all gotten used to in the last couple of years, I had a very intense dream. I don't remember most of my dreams. I've been a priest for 20 years. When I first started and when I was in school, I had a lot of these because I was nervous all the time about screwing up the next day, right? I'd miss class or whatever it was. I'd forget something. So it's been a long time since I'd had one of these. But it was intense. It was short, clearly an anxiety dream, easy. I know exactly what file to put it in when I woke up. And it was one that I used to have when I was younger. And when I was really little, it was that I was standing in the middle of the median, like in a highway, 5, and I didn't have my socks on. Like clearly trying to get my socks on to go to school was a thing, was a challenge, and I was worried about it. So I used to have it all the time. So I used to have it as a young priest, and when I was a priest, it was, when I was young, or earlier, it was that I would show up at the altar or show up at the pulpit, and I didn't have what I needed. Or I had all this stuff, but not the thing I needed, and the people would move further and further and further away as I was alone, holding everybody up, and didn't have what I needed, right? I can tell who's a priest in the room because I see the look on your face. But whatever you do, you have a version of this dream, right? There's some version of this dream that we all have, and we know it's our anxiety. So for this one, I was in the pulpit of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which is our cathedral in New York. It's 2 football fields long. You can stand the Statue of Liberty up in it. It's really, really big, right? And I used to preach there when I was a chaplain at Columbia. So beginning of my dream, no problem. I used to be there a long time ago. Maybe it's a memory. But of course, right, it doesn't end that well. So I go to it, and it's a verger that I know, who I like, and he's walking me towards it. And it's one of these big pulpits that can move around in the middle of the room. You have to open a gate to go in, and for some reason they close it and not lock it, but it feels like they lock it behind you. You hear this clink, you know? And then you walk up these stone stairs into this pulpit, and your head kind of pops up, you know, in this massive thing. So I do that, and I'm feeling pretty good about all that. And I think I have what I'm supposed to read, or I'd put it up there or something. I get up there, and people are further away than usual, which is how I know this dream isn't going to end well. They're far. And I do have paper, and it seems to reproduce itself, and then it disappears, and I can't organize it, and I'm messing with it. I can't fix it, and I can't get started. And I'm worried, and it's taking too long, and I can't figure out how to start. And it doesn't occur to me just to speak, and I'm getting anxious, nervous. And then I hear somebody down at the gate. So I pick up my robes, because I'm not going to trip, and I walk down those stairs, and I look, and it's James Cone, the theologian. I went to Union Theological Seminary, so James Cone was our systematic theology professor, so I know Dr. Cone. He had died. but I know him, so it was a familiar person, but not someone who went to the cathedral. He was AME. And James Cone, who's from right here in Arkansas, right, was born in Fordyce, grew up, I wrote it down, in Bearden, the father of Black liberation theology, had a very high-pitched voice. He wasn't the voice you expected for James Cone. It wasn't this deep, resonant kind of James Earl Jones thing. It was really high-pitched. I won't do the imitation because it's not kind, but really high-pitched. And he looks up at me and says, "Winnie, does the church have anything to say to the world in this time?" And I woke up. Right? Yeah. I don't know that that's an anxiety dream as much as like a vision or something, right? But does the church have anything to say to the world in this time? So that's the question we're here to engage. And I think it's a really important one, and clearly came to me in a way that I cannot forget. So I'm a priest working in New York. I've been there for about 20 years. I spent a couple of years in Los Angeles in that time. I'm ordained out of Los Angeles. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. So all of those are in their own ways pretty rarefied environments, but they're a breadth of the country. But also, frankly, like any other part of this country, really hard to get by if you don't have enough money, right? Life feels precarious. And what was enough money a generation ago isn't enough anymore, right? The bottom is falling out everywhere. Racism has a virulency that was not the same as 20 years ago or 20 years before that. It's changed, right? Our society has changed. If anything is different in Los Angeles or in New York, particularly in New York, is my experience, is that it's more compressed. You can't not see it. You can't hide from it. And in Dallas, where I grew up, in the suburbs, you can. You actually don't have to go to neighborhoods where you see that kind of suffering. And I grew up in the suburbs. Unless you go into someone's home, the lawns look fine, right? The car looks fine. You don't know how much debt they're in. You don't know who's addicted. You don't know who's struggling. And that's in some ways, the dilemma of the suburbs. In Manhattan, you can see it. You see people come out of buildings that you thought were fine and come stand in your food line. You see people struggling on the street. But it's the same thing that's happening in all our communities. It's just right in front of us. So if there's a takeaway from what I want to talk about tonight, which is if you don't want to listen past this, here's the one. It's that there is a lot of space in our shared public life for a moral and ethical and religious vision of a good and fair society, a vision that comes from religious communities. We often critique ourselves for just talking. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to ask you just to talk. It's really important to talk. That vision of what is right out in the world for every issue that you raised, everything that you all were talking to each other about, is not there in a robust enough way that claims the power of moral language, which as Americans, because we're still so religious, thank God, means something. It doesn't mean something everywhere in the world. You can't go to Western Europe and say, here's the moral and religious claim on justice, and have a lot of people take you seriously. In this country, it is essential to our political life and our common life, and we often, and I'll assume that you are somewhere like me as Christians, as polite Christians, maybe as liberal Christians or political Christians or Christians that believe in a robust religious diversity, are very cautious to not create offense, right? To not alienate anyone that we love. Many of us are in multi-religious families. But what we have put down in that process is a moral, ethical, I would argue, religious language around who we should be. Now, that's not proclaiming a primacy for any of our faith traditions, but that we hold within those traditions beautiful visions of justice. Beautiful. It doesn't mean that they can only be there, but I would argue for this country, that is where they are. They're not coming from anywhere else. We have them, and we must proclaim them. So that's the takeaway. That's where I'm going to get to. That's where I'm starting. And I believe very, very deeply, I hope as you can hear. So this is our responsibility as people of conscience. People out for more than just our personal well-being, which is also an abuse of this religious language, right? Just for ourselves. People from traditions in which we are taught to love our neighbor and our enemy, and to seek out the most vulnerable and expect to find the face of God there. We who seek to understand and challenge the systems that generate inequity, In this time when a reckless, immature mocking of perceived weakness dominates the public discourse, it is our work to elevate that same public discourse over which it can seem we have very little power, to not simply react, but to reconstruct, reimagine what can be, to say it, to proclaim it, to sing it, to work for it. Essentially, it is our work to free ourselves from the restrictions upon our imagination of what is right and what is good, that times like this can impose upon us. Because as we see in our elections and in our common life, most of us are just trying to survive. What's possible, right? And what we will put up with as what is possible is so much less than we would have 10 years ago. All of us in this room, I'm going to bet, unless you are yourself 10, which that's different, right? Which is cool. You have a better vision than all of us, I'm sure. And this imaginative work is the primary place where it is essential that the church meets the world. So I know in a space like this, I'm preaching to the choir, but in my experience as a member of the choir, it helps me to see things that I see every day on a slant, right? A little bit differently from someone else's perspective, so that I can see my way through again afresh. So I want to try to do that for you a little bit this evening. So Trinity Wall Street is literally at the end of Wall Street, and we are exactly what you think we are, and Wall Street is a really short street, which still surprises me for the kind of power it has in our country, right? 4 short city blocks. It wouldn't take you 10 minutes to go from one end of Wall Street to the other, walking really slowly. It's a short little street, and that part of Lower Manhattan is very narrow. And we're at the end of Wall Street and Broadway. So when the church was originally built, we were right on the water to the west, on the back of the church, and on the east was the wall, which is why it's called Wall Street. It was literally a wall, which is a great story about how walls end up, right? Because, yeah. The wall was the wall between the tiny Dutch and then English settlement that was the little colony at the tip of Manhattan, and the undefended settlers and native people of Manhattan, north of that wall. The area south of the wall, protected by the wall, less than a mile long, less than a mile wide, is tiny. And on the very south end, we still have a battery. I live in a neighborhood called Battery Park City. There's literally a little cannon and a little protecting wall so that you can shoot off the Dutch or the French or whoever's coming that way. So within this less than a mile, right, they're defending themselves all the way around. And Trinity Church stood at the end of that defense off towards the water. And what was happening in that little colony, it was a trading colony, were goods coming in from inland and then going off to Europe and the American South or the Caribbean islands and receiving goods from those same places. And we were at the heart, like many cities in the US and in Europe, of the horrific slave trade and profited greatly from it, which is a story that New York doesn't tell very often of itself. Sugar, cotton, people. And the wealth of the city comes from that time and of our church as well. And Broadway, the Broadway, which is what it was called, was the Native American path, the road well worn and used well before Europeans arrived that wound up the island of Manhattan. And right now, Manhattan is a grid, right? It's a pretty easy grid, goes like that. But Broadway kind of twists across it because it's the original path that is paved, which is pretty amazing, right? That it is that path remains in the architecture of our city and our landscape. And our little church was a result of a gift of a land grant from the British monarch at the time, planted at that intersection of defense and fear and aggression and trade and relationship and commerce. So I tell you that because I am sure that you too come from a religious institution that has a story in it. And it is the truth of our founding, who the founders were, who built the buildings, where the land came from, and whose it used to be, that lay the foundation for our institutional identity and responsibility within our communities. And we can't escape that. So for us at Trinity, what enriches us also creates an instinct to preserve, right? The reality of our city is right at our door, and the truth of our history and legacy, and for all our literal defensiveness and defenses, we don't seem to be able to defend ourselves from that history or the city itself. We quite literally hear its cries all the time. Our institutions are not innocent and isolated from the rest of society. We are corporate citizens as well as individual citizens in our communities. So it's important to understand that in thinking about the greater good, the world, we are not stepping into spaces that are not ours. And I think people that tell us that have an agenda, and we should be critical of that agenda, right? The greater good, the world, it is us. We are not choosing between becoming engaged or being peaceful. When we engage in public life, we are taking up our responsibility as organizations that have power and impact in the communities we are a part of. And when we do not, and most of us do not, most of our churches do not, or if we do not feel the need to engage, it is the equivalent of saying that society as it is all right. It lines up with our values. We have nothing to contribute, which might be how some feel, but I suspect that you don't. I don't. So what does it mean for us? And I'll start with what I don't think it means, what it does not mean, because this is where you hear the language of religious freedom and action in our country right now. There's a lively debate in our country about what religious freedom includes. That's RFRA, the Religious Freedom Act, right? In short, the law that claims to guarantee that the individual the right to express their religious freedom in aspects of their lives that are not easily or clearly, obviously, religious practice. And that's where we've made the conversation so small, right? And we've taken it away from our corporate responsibility. So this has been tested, and I know you've heard about these stories by things like who you have to sell a cake to, right? Kind of ironic. Or if a company can remove coverage for contraceptives from their healthcare plan, right? And not for a church, but for just any kind of corporation. Or if a pharmacist has to fulfill a prescription for a drug they don't believe people should use, assuming underlying reasons to take that drug. Or if a doctor has to see an LGBT patient, right? That kind of, because of their religious beliefs. That's about personal conscience. Where does our conscience or our conviction come up against the rights of other people is the question there. This was the issue that was addressed in the bus boycotts in the 60s, and the integration of soda fountains, right? Could a business owner who believed in the separation of the races, often a value defended by their Christian faith and rooted in their Christian faith, right, insist that in their business they could practice that kind of discrimination? Could a state government do that? Could a school district do that? So as you know, the idea that we all have the right to be served and treated equally by businesses or in public services is again being contested. We are living back in that space and time. But it was decided for some time that, yes, we all have the right to be treated equally. And this was a requirement of doing business, regardless of your religious beliefs. You had to treat people fairly in public. So I said that to say that is one kind of freedom. And our public life would sort of tell us that is how religious people exercise their religious voice and their freedom. And maybe that's the only way. I disagree. The freedom of you as a person of conscience to consider how you engage your community in the ways that align with your conscience personally. And if that violates the law, the truth of this would be to then suffer the consequences. That's what civil disobedience is, right? Either for the sake of changing that law because you think it's unjust, or to live faithful to your convictions in public, to change how the public understands how that conviction can be lived out. But an example from the other side of the political spectrum is the No More Deaths campaign in Arizona and that organization. So that's on the desert, on the border. In that case, individuals are being arrested for leaving water in the desert for the people who find themselves out there because they have crossed the border in a remote place, not at an official border crossing, and without official permission, which is why they cross in those places. So because of the conditions of the desert, people die out there, right, of lack of water and exposure. So literal modern-day Good Samaritans leave water and clothes sometimes for anyone who might pass. Ranchers do it in Texas and have their staff do it, have their people do it, because on their own property, they don't want the horror of finding dead bodies, right, on their own property. A basic act of charity. So of course, in this time of trying to clamp down on that long, long, long border, which has never been possible to clamp down upon, it is not a politically neutral act, even if it is a religious, moral, and ethical act of charity. Some of the people arrested for this work have also used that same law, RFRA, arguing that their moral compass, their religious impulse demands that if they know people are dying in the heat, they must do their best to help. When did we see you thirsty and offer you water, Lord? Whenever you did it to the least of these, you did it for me. So a case like this was recently decided for the accused, the water offerer, on the basis of religious freedom. It was really interesting that he was within his rights, as actually not a traditionally religious person, as an ethical person, to do this right thing. So there is this space of your individual conscience. I remember Roman Catholics when I was younger, that was the thing I knew about when I was a teenager, who wouldn't pay their share of their taxes, their federal taxes that they believed were going towards war efforts because they were pacifists. And so they would hold it in account so they could show that it was being held in account and wait till the law had changed and their money could go for good things, risking imprisonment because that is definitely against the law, an act of conscience for which they were willing to take the consequences. So there is that individual, ethical, sometimes radical action model. We testify to what we know is right. That is important. I don't want to downplay that. It's very, very important. But I'm actually here to ask you to think about something slightly different, and something that I believe is critical to this moment in our nation, a moment that has been long coming. I invite you to think about how we collectively work to dismantle the structures that perpetuate inequity in our communities, and that we do that together, bringing the full weight and moral authority of our religious institutions, maybe working in solidarity with one another as religious institutions, bringing that full weight to bear. What could we not accomplish? Over 80% of this country still identify as Christian people. Literally, what could we not accomplish? I want us to revive the moral imagination of our faith organizations to focus on our communities and our neighborhoods and our cities. And the reason that that is critical now is that our collective identity, in a positive way, our power to build up and build one another up, isn't a perspective you hear often in public life. It doesn't actually exist very often. We are all in modes of resistance on both sides, on all sides. But we know as people of faith that a moral imagination for ourselves, for our faith community, is a thing we practice. You have to develop it. It takes work. We imagine a version of ourselves as people, individuals, right? More true than who we actually are day to day. And we pray and practice our way towards it, especially in Lent, right? We hear of ideals far too grand for us. We aspire to them. We sing about them. We test them out. We fail. We shift a little. We try again. We actually know how to do this, right? We know our own experiences. We know that our histories bear down on us and make us less than we mean to be. We know this in our personal lives, and we regret, and we repent, and we face a truth, and we turn. We know this in our community life as religious institutions, right? This is kind of our racket. We know how to do this. We do it for our churches, for our synagogues, for temples, for mosques. We come together and build or renovate or restore. We raise money, we build programs, we know how to build together, and we think it's ordinary. But think about it. Where else do you do that in our society? Who has that experience? What if we applied that set of skills to our neighborhood? Right? What if we asked, who is my neighbor, and read that story in the streets of our own cities? A man was walking down Broadway, for example, one night and was set upon by robbers. They robbed him, beat him up, and left him on the road. A man and woman going to work the next morning walked by. A policeman walked by. A homeless man walked by. A Christian walked by. An undocumented person walked by. An unemployed person walked by. A person recently out of prison walked by. You know the outcome of that story is that the neighbor is the one who stops. The neighbor is not the one who anyone would expect to be the neighbor. We are challenged to be that neighbor. We are challenged to recognize in one another our neighbor. So I have a few steps because the opportunity for work in these kinds of spaces can seem just endless. Who is our neighbor? Everyone's our neighbor. Well, how are we going to do that, right? It's too much. There is so much to do. So where do we start? Do we even start? Is there a place to start? So I want to tell you a little bit about how we did it at Trinity and how we're working on it. And I think it's important to consider three things. This is my own little personal analysis. One, our history and our landscape, our institutional DNA and our heritage, who we are. You're never going to become anything other than who you are. You might be a better version, a reformed version. You might be saved, we believe in that. But you're going to be where you are, right? We are who we are. We don't deny that. Current movements, where is there opportunity? maybe the opportunistic piece, where are there movements, right? We don't go alone. Where is an opportunity to succeed, to put our thumb on the scale and go together? And then finally, where can we find deep solidarity? Can we practice solidarity together? And what that means is to resist the temptation, or have the tools to resist the temptation to be heroes. I have it in myself, a do-gooder, right? And it really is a temptation. So how do we instead walk alongside people who suffer from things as they are, be with them, but also be loud and be advocates, because often we are the ones that can, but to learn with those who live under the thumb of oppressive systems in our society in profound solidarity, not as heroes. So at Trinity, we have a colonial heritage, and that, upon reflection, we find still marks us. It sort of brushes over whose land we stand on because the land was taken before we got there, but clearly we stand on land that was not ceded, it was taken. The original building was built by slaves because the slaves of the first vestrymen had to come for one day. You had to give that, if you were on the vestry, the labor of a human being who you owned to build the first building. It is in the stone of our building. The history of our country is the history of our church. We were built to be the parish for New York when it was a colony, so what that means today, to be responsible for our city, is a real question that we try to answer. In what ways can we be responsible for a city that is multi-religious, wonderfully diverse in every way, with tens of millions of people? No one could have imagined that when they offered that swamp at the bottom of Manhattan for a little parish church. So in the last decade, as we've thought about that, we were working on public education because there was opportunity for reform in that, in our city. And frankly, that window closed. There is not opportunity in quite the same way in New York. But working in public education, which is very much the legacy, we have one of the most segregated systems in the country and the largest system in the country. It is a legacy of slavery and segregation for us. But working on that led us to the school to prison pipeline, which is really interesting, right? That seemed to be that kind of led us to that work, which led us to questioning mass incarceration. So of course, individually, we were all thinking about these things, but it was interesting when institutionally we started to think about these things. So if we as an institution are concerned about this, what would we do? Thankfully, there are lots of resources, and we realized that that was a movement growing in our city at the time. So we created a focus of working to be anti-racist and to dismantle systems of racism, institutional racism in our city, by working to end mass incarceration. What a grand statement that would be, and an absurd statement to make if that was us by ourselves. But instead, we were standing alongside brilliant people, lots of formerly incarcerated people, working on this in New York City. And when we started, we had no idea what was possible 5 years ago. But we were with a lot of people doing really great work. It was an opportunity. While the work of education reform was stuck and the opportunity had passed, there was this new work. This led us to learning about movements for decarceration, which I'm very proud to say is a word that gets bandied about on the vestry of Trinity Church Wall Street right now, because we are that cool that we can talk about decarceration, which is amazing to me, which led us to supporting the closing Rikers Island, which is just New York City's modern-day penal colony. It's a disaster. It's an island that is for prison, just a complete disaster. If you fly into LaGuardia, you fly over it. It's right there, which led us to working for bail reform, which led us as a community to profound acts of solidarity, of hearing stories of people in prison for lack of $100 or $1,000, right? Families torn apart, taking feedback because we were telling these stories in our pulpits, and because someone like me had to make it simple enough to be understood, because I had never understood it. I had never thought it through before until someone sat in front of me and said, "Let me tell you what happened to me," right? Embarrassed, frankly, to be in my mid-40s, the first time I thought really hard about what it actually meant. And because it had been translated for someone as ignorant as me to understand it, I could put it right back in a pulpit and say it boldly and clearly in plain English to a room full of compassionate people that had actually never thought about it. Because if someone I know gets arrested, I can get him a lawyer and I can get him out. I can do it really fast. And if someone gets arrested and needs my help with bail, I can get that done really quick, and I will get it done really quick. But that's not true, right? For all kinds of people, simply because of their poverty, just poverty, and overwhelmingly affecting Black and brown people all over the country, and especially in the city of New York, which I know a little bit better. And when we started to do it, immediately we started to get directed at us the kind of dismissiveness and rage and anger from powerful places in New York City that, of course, are always directed at those involved in the justice system. And it had never come at me before. And I've taken my share of hate mail over the years. But to have bail bondsmen, right, and police unions going after you or attacking is scary. I have to admit, I was scared. It was scary. I felt fear. I felt it kind of deep. And of course, that is what they all go through all the time. This is the weight of the system, which I have to say has transformed my sense of the power of that system, right? Which led us to supporting programs that work to strengthen communities, to prevent interactions with the police, period, to keep that sinking feeling away from everyone's stomach forever, if possible, which led us to supporting restorative justice practices, organizations that work on it to build stronger communities, bringing victim and offender together, finding ways to reform and make communities whole again, which led us to organizing and towards building affordable housing, developing more food programs, offering trauma-informed practices of supporting the whole person, really quite extensive and bold, which will lead us to more. I hope you can hear that we are walking a path alongside some of the most vulnerable people in our city as some of the most protected people in our city. And on that path, we are learning a lot about ourselves and our church community. We find that there is no them, it is all us. Every issue that I mentioned just now impacts someone in our congregation. We have taken something that they were carrying quietly, maybe something of which they were ashamed, and turned it into something their church wants to support them on publicly. Sometimes something their church sees as the result of an unfair or unjust system. We are healing ourselves, and we are healing our own community. So Trinity is a very influential church, so we have chosen to stand in these difficult places. We must because we can. And all of this we are doing in partnership with other organizations, nonprofits, and sometimes with government, with city and state agencies. There are no bad guys, no one we're not willing to talk to if we can make our systems better, no one that we will demonize, even though some are happy to demonize us. That's something churches know how to do very well. We can stand in complicated places better often than activists and advocates and not-for-profits because we don't actually have to stake the same claims and have the same outcomes. It's a particular gift that we have. And so we bring all of ourselves to try to make more effective the work of making change in our city. And really practically, we're just getting in and staying in for the long time that it will take to make change. It is the work of generations to shift something like this. It has taken us generations to get to this kind of crisis. So like you as well, I'm sure, we are learning a new language as we go. Words I didn't know about, an understanding of lived experience among my neighbors that I really didn't know much about at all, though I had read about all these issues. I can pass the test. I'm smart, I've got my political side lined up, I've got good politics probably, and have learned so much in relationship with people who are subject to these systems. So what has surprised me the most, and to my mind, among the most important reasons for us to get in together about the work that we're doing as faith groups is that telling a story, that making meaning, that finding God among us, talking about it, which is doing theology, is the word for it, right? Is that work is our work. No one else will do it. And I apologize if I'm leaving anyone behind in the way I'm talking about this, but in our work and in our life in general, you know what you're needed for in your family, in the places that you work. You know what value you bring. Right? People might ask you to do other things, but you know when you're distracted because there's this thing that you do really well, the thing you must do. For the church, and I think this is true of many, many faith organizations, we do all kinds of things. And they're fine, they're good, they're important. But doing the theology is what we do. Our proclamation, and that's not just the work for the clergy, I mean all of us. Finding words for our values and claiming God in a space, that God acts in the world, that God demands things, that God has a vision for us, is the work of the church. And if we don't do it, no one else will do it. It will not be done. Or people who we really don't want doing it will do it, which is what a lot of where we are today, right? The vacuum. There's a huge vacuum of this kind of language. So we do this equipped with our sacred texts, which describe from the beginning a created order that falls short, but also the regular reminding by God to look out for the vulnerable, look out for the prisoner, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan. And isn't it interesting? We're so used to the list, you could have ended it for me. That's a very specific list. There are a lot of other categories of people. That's the list that keeps coming back. So think about that: the foreigner, the outsider, the widow, the orphan, the prisoner, the hungry, the thirsty. From the beginning, we are told to take note of what we can ignore. Jesus goes so far as to position Jesus himself in those places and speak from there to the people who would be found there. It is literally where Jesus is to be found, we're told. So we must do our spiritual and theological work. If we are not, with our words, speaking and writing these possibilities, they won't exist. It is our particular, peculiar gift and work. So for Trinity, this means that we are now in the Close Rikers campaign, which is a pretty ambitious campaign, and I preach about it a lot, which just surprises me that this is what we're talking about, and that we're probably going to do it. I think it's going to happen. I think it'll happen in the next 10 years, frankly. And it's a tough place to stand. There are a lot of steps to get there. Some of them that are tough are that to get it done, we've got to build smaller prisons, but you're building prisons. If anyone ever told me I'd be in the business of advocating for building prisons, right, it's horrible. It's just horrible. And a smaller prison isn't that small. That's room for 1,000 people often. It's still a huge number, but it sort of puts in front of all of us the horror of what we had locked off on that island. And it might be a stage, I hope it is a stage, towards getting to a better place. But literally, no one knows how to talk about why we might do this as a step towards ending this, except people that are speaking from a moral space. Right? Everybody is very practically coming up with all these stages, and we are saying, we believe that we can end the justice system as we have it today. We believe we can build something better, that we must. But we can also help us get there. We can imagine taking that path across. We can imagine the journey. And we have tried to do it together. And for me, this is where solidarity, alliance, walking alongside, and listening comes in. Working with people affected by these systems as we're learning reminds me that these are issues of life and death every day for so many. I can close the file and go home, and I do. But however much this weighs on my heart, and it worries me or I feel fear, is nothing like the real terror in people's lives that are a shockingly high percentage of the population, and again, overwhelmingly, disproportionately Black or brown people in our country, right? That everything can be snatched away for living in the wrong neighborhood, being in the wrong encounter, being born in the wrong place, making the wrong move. Real lives like mine and like yours. And there I remember that our power is one another. Our power is our faith. Our power is our imagination. We can imagine a better way. So I know that you are doing this kind of work and thinking about it in the context that you're in, and thank you for it. It's so important. I hope you are encouraged to persist, to stay in for the long haul. Your prayers, your vision are critical. None of this is fast. I feel like I'm pretty practical, and I still am stunned regularly at how long this is going to take. We're not there yet. We're not done. I'm ready to move on to the next thing, and it's not right? We got to stay. We've got to stay. All of us have to stay. Your prayers, your vision are critical. And if you are beginning to think about this for your community, God bless you. Your hopefulness is important, and I hope you'll think about the weight of the institution that you can bring to bear, all the power you have in the institutions that you are a part of. We have a lot of power. You have so much more to offer. We have so much more to offer than actually makes any sense. There's so much that we can do. Our presence is critical. And for striving to love one another, we are told that if we strive to love one another, in that process, we ourselves become free. So for Dr. Cohn's question, yes, I think the church has something to say to the world in this time. But it isn't a word for any one of us to find alone. It is for all of us together. We have an extensive remaking to do of a moral imagination in this country that remembers our vast resources. We have more than enough to do everything that we can imagine. We can take apart the injustices that seem inevitable, and we can imagine, that are imagined and maintained by people just like us. It's people like us on all the sides. It can be undone, and we can begin to build the right things right here alongside one another, and I have full confidence that we can. So let us pray. Lord God Almighty, who has made all the peoples of the earth for thy glory, to serve thee in freedom and in peace. Give to the people of our country a zeal for justice and the strength of forbearance, that we may use our liberty in accordance with thy gracious will, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen. That's also from our prayer book, which is an excellent resource for this work. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Winnie. If you'll let us ask questions and take comments. But before we do that, I'm curious if you are involved in the decarcerate work, the bail project work, the judicial reform work that we are a part of, would you, or any work that we do in prison, Sunday night work or Enneagram, would you raise your hand and let us see that? Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah, you've touched something close to us. Yeah, thank you.
Right on.
Thank you. All right, questions or comments for Winnie? And we ask you to use the microphone because we live stream this. We also record it, and so we can hear you perhaps without a microphone, but I promise people watching on the internet cannot hear you on a microphone. Questions or comments for Winnie? Yeah, all the way in the back. Jerry, thank you.
Speak into the microphone.
Hi, Winnie. I thought I heard you say you were involved in building prisons, and I was shocked by that. So say more about that.
Yeah, I have to say, it is the stage of this work that I find tough, frankly. So part of what we have learned at Trinity about ourselves is we have the resource and the capacity to stay in for a long time in movements. And so there are these administrative practical components, often after legislation is passed, that we can fund, we can make happen. Like we just did raise the age, but there was no money to, so that's the age of that young people can be incarcerated. There's no money to move, to implement it, so we supported that. So with the Rikers work, to close Rikers, you've got to have a place to put people. So you can imagine as an advocate, and I would have this position, I'd say tear it all down. Like why would we do that, right? It's wrong. The truth is, it's not going to happen that way. So if we just say tear it all down, everything stays exactly the same, frankly. And maybe that's right. Maybe that is the right way to get to some moment of emergency that will change this. That's not the path we're taking at Trinity. What we are supporting is if we could build borough-based jails, what we are giving away is that we think people are going to be arrested and continue to be arrested in New York City. We have a big police force. They're going to arrest people. Right? We're going to have crime into the foreseeable future. So if we're going to have crime and people are going to be arrested, ideally they would be in jail if they're waiting to make bail or have to be held for some reason, remanded, that they would do that in the neighborhood they are from or where they're arrested. You could find them. That the jail is in a neighborhood, it's not off on an island that takes all day to get to, that your lawyer can find you, that the community can find you, that we can hold people accountable if someone is held for a long time or has a mental health crisis or something like that. And that if we're going to, and then we'd say, so you're held in your community, and you would be held by the court. So there's not a day of in shackles on a bus, missing your court date, and then being in trouble again because that's happened. So it's right in the community. And that the first floor of that, and maybe more floors, should be community services that we need in our city, right? It should be the place you get your food stamps and whatever other community help you might need. It's a resource center. And it might be where you go if you're on parole or on probation. All that would be robust in the middle of the community. So that sounded really great when we started the process. It made so much sense. It still makes sense as I say it. The part I didn't think about is that means there is a stage in which you are building jails. And that's where we are right now. We are saying that in the boroughs of New York City, where there is a jail, we'll need to expand it and change it to create all these resources that we want. And in some places, we've got to build a building. And as you can imagine, like NIMBY has come out in force on all sides, right and left, like hell if you're building a jail in our neighborhood. And we all kind of agree, not because we think jails are dangerous. That's actually proven to not be true, because we have jails in our city. Those aren't dangerous places, or they don't harm real estate or any of those things. Who wants to be in the business of building jails? But we won't get to the next stage without it. And so as an institution, we are actually making the case in social media and in our writing and speaking as to why this is a necessary step if we're going to close Rikers Island, moving to a stage of reform where we hope we are then revamping those buildings and using them for something totally different in 10 years, really soon, that population keeps going down. But in the meantime, most of us I cannot see a way politically to get to closing Rikers and to get to the next stage without building something.
In your work at Trinity, would you say something about the process that helps you recognize that you have to do something that you don't really want to do? How do you navigate practical? Yeah, how does that conversation happen?
Yeah, so one is we're really good at saying that we are not experts in this, in the same way that we're all talking about coronavirus and none of us are epidemiologists, right? We are not experts on prison reform and decarceration, but a lot of wonderful people are. And so we grant to some of them, we hold convenings, we go to their meetings, we hold very particular convenings for religious leaders so that we can think about how to talk about that. And so in the course of that, we came to align with a very particular movement to close Rikers, and we helped to support their communications, and we've granted towards them because we think they have the plan that will get this done. It helped us that was a plan that, and we're now leading this from Trinity for homelessness. It was a plan that brought everyone interested in incarceration and decarceration in the city together to build this plan together, to look at everything, to look at land use for old Rikers, to look at every issue that impacts this and come up with a comprehensive way to, and frankly, the idea of closing Rikers is just poetic for all of us. Nobody wants there to be a Rikers Island, but it is a way to actually look at the whole criminal justice system, so it's a tool. So we didn't come up with that. We partnered with people that were working towards it, and then once they came up with their platform, we figured which parts of that platform we could confidently lead, and which were the ones that really, frankly, we were uniquely positioned to lead, and what, or not lead, but take a strong voice in. I wouldn't say we're leading anything. And one is, we are a real estate company. We can talk about land use, and we can talk about the value of things around it. Yeah, we have, with authority, we can talk about those things, and we know how to stand in tough conversations around real estate. We are not idealistic in that way, so why not use that for the good in this? So it was really kind of aligning, who are we? What does this need? You know, there are some spaces where we have less authority, and so we're not the leader in that, or we wouldn't choose a leading voice. But this one, we do have a lot of capacity to speak to it. I have to say, we all find it internally as staff tough, all of us, to say, yeah, we are advocates for building a jail, because we know how we can get to the end, and we hope we will stay in to get to the end. But if we don't, right, we might have. The worry is, have we created a bigger problem? And which is always these are the questions that can keep you from acting at all, right? So we also have one another to keep in this very practical conversation about how we get there, because the people that have put this plan together this is their life's work, are committed to closing Rikers Island, believe we have a window to do it, and believe this is the way.
Thank you. Darren.
Today we see so many that, prisons are being built,
Yep.
but they're for profit.
Oh yeah.
How would your plan differ from that?
Yeah.
Because people are getting rich off of building prisons.
Yeah, it's hideous. I think there are a couple of different ways it has to be made illegal for it to not happen in your state, and I think we just did the final one. So in our state, we don't have that. So these are public buildings owned by the public, and they have to be designed by the public. We have to agree to build them. That hasn't been agreed to yet. We go through a land use process, and so it's we don't have that in New York, but I've lived in California and Texas, where we definitely have that. I think you're pointing to it points to a very important issue that, what is it? If you're a hammer, everything's a nail, right? We keep building detention centers because we have these companies that do it. That's what they know how to do, and they keep getting these government contracts to do it. And we're putting all kinds of, we keep finding ways to incarcerate people and hold them. So the plan in New York, where I think it's different than that, is we're changing the reasons people are being held. And we want to tear down every facility on Rikers that you could hold someone in. That's part of that plan. So it's not that we're creating a couple of new buildings with much less capacity than Rikers has, and we have Rikers. Because we're cynical enough to know, we're realistic enough to know, if we leave those buildings up, they'll get used again. So just destroy it. And then there will be ultimately many, many fewer beds in these few things that we're building, and they're not the lowest number projected, but they are among the lowest numbers projected of people that might be detained on any one night in New York City because they have been picked up and accused of a crime. The goal is to get to a point where if you are arrested in New York, unless you are in the middle of a horribly violent act, visibly violent public act, caught in the midst of it, that you would get a desk ticket and you show up at your trial date. That is the right way to do it. We're not quite there yet, but the idea is that these are just much smaller buildings And they're, unlike all these for-profit detention centers that are being built and these detention centers on our border, part of the logic of that is they're in places that you can't find. No one gets there. Like we tried to go on the border to one, you literally couldn't find it on Google Maps, right? It was blacked out, and you could kind of see where it was because you could see little walls. They're in the middle of nowhere in isolation, and so one of the big differences is this is right in the middle of the community. So the kind of horrors that are happening, it should not be possible in the same way for that to happen there. But I hear you on the basic piece. We should not be holding people in places where they have no rights.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
Could I return to a question sort of following up with Evans? At Trinity, when you work on these problems, do you have a mechanism in place that you have like intergenerational conversation? I'm struck by your point that it's going to take decades and decades and decades.
Yeah.
And many of us, work on projects here at St. Paul's, and we look around and say, oh, I see the median age there.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that if you're going to take on projects that are going to take decades to do,
Yep.
you have to have your young people working on it right now at the same time as your middle-aged people and your old people. Is that in place?
Yeah, so the way we did, so same, we probably like you all, we've got a robust family ministry, we've got lots of kids, we have all generations represented, but we are older. I mean, the majority is older, the vestry is older. The staff is a pretty wide range of ages, but where we find our intergenerational partnership, definitely in the committees of the church, definitely on our staff, is in the advocacy groups we work with and the nonprofits that we work with and city government, that there we are working with people with a bold vision for the future and working alone in small groups with very little funding, and we are partnering as a peer with them. So that brings a lot of energy to the conversation, often brings a really radical vision to the conversation, and means that as long as we keep the institutional relationship going, we could stay in for a really long time, even if we don't have the right generational representation internally. But I also find as we get more involved in an issue like this, our young people know it. Our high school kids, our college kids, they know exactly what it is, and they are proud to be with it. They're with us. The work itself has drawn out the activist voice of the younger people in our congregation, which then brings them into these. They weren't going to come join the committee on that work, but when the work got tied into other work in the city, they can be a part of. They understand it.
Lowell.
Can we put in a little local plug for the Bail Project and how folks might want to get involved with that here?
Yes. Yeah.
Mac Mayfield is one of those. Oh, yeah. So Mac Mayfield has offered his email address for getting in touch with Bail Project locally. I know we've had trainings here at St. Paul's. I know several folks are part of that. Anybody want to say something about if somebody would like to be in the Bail Project, how you can help get people bailed out so they don't have to sit in jail because they don't have enough money until their hearing starts?
Yeah, let me give you a brief synopsis and then maybe a contact information. We have convinced the courts to help us see their dockets and to see who has either probation appointments, parole appointments, drug tests, or other hearings. And we are calling individuals, reminding them of their appointments, and if they are transportation inhibited, we've got volunteers who will drive them, and sometimes drive them across the state, because the difference between going to jail for who knows how long and still being able to keep your job and be with your family and provide for those who need your income is whether or not you can get to an appointment. And so that's work that our parish is doing. Mac Mayfield is the right person to contact. If that's something you're interested in, speak to me before you leave or reach out to me, and I'll make sure that you have Mac's email address. I'd love for you to be a part of that work. Absolutely. Thank you, Lowell. Thank you.
Excellent.
Jerry again? Oh, speak to Jerry. That's right. Jerry does that work. Thank you, Jerry. Jerry Overton in the back. Wave your hand again so we can all see Jerry. Jerry and Mac are partners in that work. Thank you, Jerry. Speak to Jerry before you leave. He's better than me on that. Thank you.
And if you can't do it a lot, I would actually recommend to you, if you can't do it a lot, you can't be on for a long time, commit to trying to do it once. So the last time I did it, it was a part of a project where you got these really big checks to help people out that had huge bails, but were not considered a threat by the lawyers that had vetted them. So this person, I'm trying to make sure I only tell you what I can tell you about this person, but was my age, exactly my age. If they were trying to win me over, they did it, right? A mother couple of kids, looking after her mother as well, her mother lived with them, stole a winter coat, and not a nice one, right? It was Les Mis, it was a crime of need, stole a winter coat that was her size, and it was captured on a camera in the store. The store figures it out later, because I guess the coat is missing or something. They see her on the camera. She is stopped by a plainclothes police officer leaving her home. So she resists, because who is this? It happens in New York all the time. And so is accused of, and has a very high bail because she's stolen a coat and has resisted arrest, right? So right there, the number goes up. And then goes in, and things just don't go right for her while she's in. The bail I paid is the down payment on a house. Yeah. Had been in for a couple of weeks, was going to be in there forever, because the cycle of getting caught up and getting, just having the thing spiral. And when I talked to the lawyer about it, I said, oh, well, when is the trial date? I want to go. I'll be anonymous. I just want to see this. And he said, oh, there'll never be a trial date. The police would never come to this. It was a coat. So she's being held for how long, right? And there will never, it's a coat that's not worth much, right? The police officer won't go. I have to say again, I know the facts about things like this. I literally feel like I got saved again, like I got it again. I got it deeply again. So there's certain things you just got to go to remember your own humanity. It's something to go do, just to recall.
Thank you. The Bail Project is moving a staff member into our area because of the work that Jerry and Mac and others have been doing. They've recognized, in fact, our organization, our community organizing work and the relationship we have with the courts is a model that they're now using in other communities. So it's that grassroots work that's making that possible. Yeah. Questions, comments? David, and then Sarah.
Are the members of your parish politically diverse?
Yes.
And how do you keep them cooperating and joining in this mission?
Yes. Interestingly, it might not sound like it, but frankly, we picked something that was not partisan. As we all know, I'm sure you all know this here, prison reform is not a partisan issue. There are lots of folks on the far right and the far left and in between that think our prison system is screwed up. And so we could have picked an issue that was more partisan, but many of the big issues of our day, right, environment, prison reform, interestingly, depending on how you frame them, they're not necessarily partisan. So absolutely there are people that I'm sure grit their teeth or don't show up if I'm in the pulpit. I'm sure that's true. Absolutely sure that's true. But we work really hard to say, I don't think any of our parties are getting any of this right. And so, I mean, who are you going to get behind that's going to solve any of the issues that we care the most about, probably? So I try very hard in all of our language that we use at Trinity, and we work with consultants and firms, whatever. And it's interesting. Some of we use different language than some of the advocacy groups, and we use different language than I think some of the very political, wonderful people on our staff might choose to use, because I think we have to be true to who we are. In the diversity of the range of opinions within our church, we can still stand strong on what we think the right outcome is, but I think I keep an ear to it will not be partisan. We're not supporting a party or a person. We're supporting a justice issue that we see in the text manifested in our community today, and we think we can make a difference and make people's lives better.
Yeah, it's Winnie and I were talking about today that we offer community meals on Mondays and Wednesdays, and Central Methodist across the street does it on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And politically, socially, we're fairly, at least especially now, fairly distinct congregations. And yet, feeding the hungry is a politically neutral response. Income inequality,
Right.
you go deeper
Why
and you
they're
keep
on is
advocating.
different,
Yeah, and how,
yeah.
and I do think, and you've invited us to think about the unique voice that our faith has to transform those systems. That might feel different or sound different, but the simple act of addressing the issue of food insecurity is something that can across that aisle.
And
at
if it
least.
helps in that question, because I think there is I can't think of a community that's actually completely politically aligned, but the first congregation I worked in as a curate, and I'd gone to Union Seminary, so I came out ready to fight, right? And West LA, and our parish was Brentwood, Bel Air, and Westwood. And Mr. Reagan had just retired to our neighborhood, to Bel Air. He was in our parish. And so a lot of his staff had retired there. And they came to church. They're good Episcopalians. And it took me a minute to realize that's who this was and where I was. And it never occurred to me. I don't know any other way to read the text but the way I read it. Like, I couldn't change any of that. But it did make me sensitive to making flip remarks about politics and alignment and making assumptions about party and what that might mean, which frankly, if I had been in a more liberal church, I don't think I would have, because everybody would have laughed with me, right? It would have worked. But because of that diversity in that, and it's LA, so LA has a certain kind of liberalism too, a very socially liberal place. But it made me take some care in my words that I think is actually the right care for the church to take. And I don't know that I would have learned that if I hadn't been in this place where literally we prayed for that man every day on a public prayer list. I'm sure for my own salvation is why, but every single day. And that we can do that. That church didn't just hold together, it grew during really tough times, 9/11 and other things, really reactionary times. So there are ways to do this well, I think.
And you said, Sarah, I know you're waiting, but you said earlier that the church is actually better at that than a lot of not-for-profits or other agencies, because we don't denigrate individuals, even if we disagree, or at least we have the ability to stand in relationship with those with whom we disagree. Yeah. Thank you. Sarah.
As you're talking about standing in solidarity and working with the agencies and the nonprofits, what about inroads like with those who are inside of the the prisons and the jails and the leaders, like around here we're thinking about working with our county sheriffs and stuff like that. But like continuing conversation or even then moving on to legislation. And so what are some inroads and successes or some tribulations that have been overcome as you're working in that end of the project?
I was surprised to find, all the lawyers, including on our team at Trinity that work on this, know a lot of people that work in the prison system. Right? They know the wardens and they know staff, which was a surprise to me, frankly. I hadn't thought a lot about it. We were calling about some work at Rikers, and I saw the name of the person I was supposed to call and realized I knew that person. That person had gone to Union Theological Seminary, was younger than me, but had gone, and I knew her family. They had gone to church I knew them from Los Angeles, and she worked at Rikers, and it was a big, it was a good opening for me, for my own thinking of who knows the system and its injustice is better than the people that work there, right? That I shouldn't assume anything. And so we know, or our people that we work with know the wardens at all of the prisons that we're working with, and we know the people in the city that are doing that work, and we assume, and we know the people that are running probation in our city, and it's an interesting back and forth on our staff, right? So I was shocked by the fact that people knew wardens. Those same colleagues that know them are shocked that I want to work with probation, because we need to dismantle that system, is what they would say. And so we are checking each other all the time in a really good way. Our challenge is we're called to see the best in people, right? Not to be naive about that, or especially naive if we see that that's not true around the work we're trying to do. But we stay in relationship with everyone that will be in relationship with us, and we support work in probation, even though we don't want young people going into the criminal justice system in any way for mistakes that our young people don't have to get into that system for. At the same time, while the system exists, some really good work can happen in that space. And then the other extreme end of that, I'd say, is that through the programs, we also are in relationship with people that are currently incarcerated or are formerly incarcerated. And many in that conversation, often we're hearing about how wardens and others are the reason their lives have turned around and that they have opportunity, having been trapped in the system to begin with. And so I have learned to put down, I do tend to think in black and white and good and bad, and that gets checked in me all the time. In terms of legislation, raise the age is one. And we passed bail reform in New York. It's being pushed back on really hard. It's being resisted. We've only had it for 2 months, so I don't know what these stats are that people have in 2 months that are real, but we passed it. It's good. It's not as good as we wanted, and we are pushing hard with everyone else to not have it changed yet. And when the announcement was made that the I don't know what the person is called in the state Senate, who's the leader of the majority party, we've never had that support for this legislation in the past. He made that announcement at St. Paul's Chapel at a clergy prayer breakfast, and I heard someone drop their coffee cup, like heard it like hit the ground, heard the splash, and because I didn't quite believe I'd heard what I heard, so I rephrased it just so he could say it again, because if he supports it, it's done. But interestingly, like in that space where we had called clergy together and electeds, and we all made, the rabbi and I started with Bible verses about, what is it? Do not persecute the poor for their poverty. It's in the Psalms, right? So we had done some version of that, said some whatevers. And every legislator that got up started with a Bible verse as well. They just decided to go into that space and made these really kind of beautiful presentations, very different than I think they had expected to, on why this was important. And then the speaker gets up and says, I'm going to support this. So that is this beautiful, like, religious space. So I mean, I'm sure he knew he came in there to make that statement in that space, but it was pretty powerful. And then they actually passed it, which is the first big step to getting Rikers closed.
Thank you. Jerry, in the back again? Yep.
Yes, Jerry.
When I was a child and I would act out, my mother would make me sit on a stool, and she would say to me, you sit there until you think you can do better. And I've often thought, what if we saw prisons like that as an enforced timeout until they could be rehabilitated? Because many prisoners are there for minor offenses, for drug abuse, for mental illness, for simply living a life of abuse. And what better way to rehab them than that? In terms of our system here, we have a huge problem. On any given day, there are 300 to 400 people that are incarcerated, awaiting trial. They have not been charged, and they're there because they're poor. They can't post bail. And yet it costs our county $70 a day to keep a prisoner. Now think about that. If we've got 300 people in there, it's $70 a day. That's $21,000 a day that the county is paying to keep people in jail that are not a threat to society. And it's just insane. And so that's one of the things that this group I'm with is working on, to see if we can't get them released and not, I mean, it's insane to pay that kind of money.
It is. It's pre-trial,
keep them in jail.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of what you come up against, which is what we knew we would, but it's the right tool for us, it's the right way for us to approach it where we are, is what you come up against, and we're coming up against it right now, is, of course it's illogical. It's absolutely illogical if you think all people are equal, you know? It's absolutely illogical. But we have disposable people in our society, and that is based on race and income and all kinds of other things, but really race and income and race and race and race, right? And it forces us, it's different than sitting in an anti-racism group and getting yourself right. This is what institutional racism looks like. And we've got to take it apart, because you wouldn't be rethinking bail reform right now. It's not just the police unions and others. We wouldn't be rethinking it in New York if we didn't believe that there's a whole category of people that are fundamentally criminal, right? We just wouldn't be doing it. So it forces us to do our work. So I think part of what a church part of what we've got to do is, yes, we're going to keep fighting, but we got to do this other work of how do we get here? How do we stay here? And we need to be really able in that space, because we are doing something illogical. At the same time, nothing's illogical. It's logical. We need to break that logic. That can't be how we act anymore.
Let's say thank you to Winnie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. So grateful that you're here this evening, and look forward to tomorrow. The adult forum at 10 o'clock in this space, but also preaching at 8:45 and 11. Hope you'll be here. Don't be an hour late. Remember to set your clocks forward. Thank you again to St. Spatulus Guild. If you've got a glass under your chair, if you would take it to the gray bus tub right away. Thank you all very much.